In Chapter 3, Section 5, we're going to take a look at new trends in federalism. So, as we go through this section, you should be keeping in mind the essential question number 18. What are the new trends in federalism? President Ronald Reagan created a concept, basically, the New Deal cooperative federalism had existed since that New Deal era. And when President Reagan comes into office, he proposes something he calls new federalism to adjust the federal state relationship. Um, and it becomes the hallmark of his administration. And it basically wanted to return administrative power to the state governments. We call his time in office the Reagan Revolution. And during the Reagan Revolution, the Dems and liberal interest groups thought that federal grants were an effective way to raise the level of services provided to the poor, but Reagan and Republicans attacked grants as imposing national priorities on states. Remember that since the era of LBJ, the grants had more favored the interests of the national government rather than helping to the states address their own needs and their own policy priorities. Thus, in the early 80s, for the first time in 30 years, federal aid to states and local governments actually declines. Reagan persuaded Congress to consolidate a lot of those categorical grants that we talked about before, grants given for a specific purpose. That specific purpose dictated national policy goals at times, into what are known as block grants, or a large grant given to a state by the federal government with only very general spending guidelines. Many of these things went to education and healthcare. Governors argued basically to expand the practice because it was shifting power back to the state governments. Calls to reform the welfare state system by allowing states to determine what was done with the money and act as laboratories of democracy seem popular with citizens and governments alike. So basically, popularity of these sort of grants, popularity of shifting power back to the states, of allowing the states to act as the policy makers and act as laboratories of democracy, were popular amongst a majority of Americans. And so this new federalism idea that had been proposed by Reagan during his campaign was taking hold. The devolution revolution takes place after the Reagan administration. In 1994, the Republican members, actually during the Clinton administration, in 1994, the Republican members of the House joined House Minority Whip Newt Gingrich's contract with America. In this contract, Republican candidates pledged to force a debate on the role of national government in regards to the states. The main goal of these Republicans was to scale back the federal government, and that's why we call it the devolution revolution. Republicans took the House for the first time in 40 years on the back of this contract with America. Gingrich actually is named Speaker of the House because of his success with this promise. And a majority of the proposals in the contract actually passed the House of Representatives. But similar to what's taking place today, very few of these proposals, despite flying through the House of Representatives, actually passed the Senate. But they did succeed on a number of issues. For one, they succeeded on the issue of unfunded mandates that I referred to in the previous section. These are national laws that direct state or local governments to comply with federal rules or regulations, such as clean air or water standards, but contain little or no federal funding to defray the cost of meeting those requirements. The Republicans and the contract with America representatives pointed out that nearly 30% of local funds were directed towards meeting federal standards that did not include federal dollars. So the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act was passed in 1995, which prevented Congress from passing costly federal programs without a debate on how to fund those programs And basically, what it did was address the primary concern of state governments, that they were being forced to do these things, but they weren't being given money to do them. They also achieved a policy goal, getting the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Act passed, which got rid of the existing federal welfare program and returned much of the administrative power for welfare programs to the states. Under the Bush administration, George W. Bush initially promised to follow the Reagan traditions and return power to the states. But because of a number of unforeseeable events, including a struggling economy, the attacks on 9/11, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the rising cost of entitlement programs, creating huge state and federal deficits, made his promise to continue to return power to the states nearly impossible. Further, he went on to pass the No Child Left Behind Act, which is a big swath or a big grab for federal power. And basically, what it did was it required the federal government required schools to do a large number of things that previously would have been mandated by state or local power. And instead, now you had the federal government um, requiring these things, what people might call preemption. What is preemption? It is a concept that allows the national government to override state or local action in certain areas, in this case, in education. And it was done, preemption is allowed because of the supremacy clause. If the federal government regulates in an area, the state governments are compelled to meet those regulations because the national government, federal law, is the supreme law of the land. Laws which preempt state laws were not new, but in the past, these preemptive laws were supported by Democrats. This signaled a possible new era of preemption supported by Republicans. Judicial federalism, both uh, can't be underestimated. The importance of judicial federalism, both the Supreme Court's role in setting the parameters of federalism, and the executive's role in advocating its position before the court, are very important. And we'll talk about how exactly how the executive advocates its position before the court when we get to the looking specifically at the judicial branch. But as an example, Congress's New Deal legislation didn't alter the state-federal relationship until the court changed its position on the constitutionality of those programs. So it's partly the Congress and partly the executive's policy positions, but also the Supreme Court's interpretation of the constitutionality of those policy positions that shifts power from the states to the national government. From 1930s to the 1980s, the Supreme Court generally expanded the national government's authority and therefore role. In the 1980s, the court's willingness to allow Congress to be regulated in a variety of areas waned, coinciding with the Reagan Revolution and Reagan appointees to the Supreme Court. So power was shifting back towards the states. Reagan's attempts to appoint justices who were conservative and therefore committed to states' rights and rolling back federal intervention was pretty successful. In 1981, for instance, he appointed the first female Supreme Court justice, Sandra Day O'Connor, who shared his view on states' rights and rolling back government intervention. William H. Rehnquist, a Reagan somebody who was in line with Reagan's ideals, became the Chief Justice. Anton Scalia, hyper-conservative, definitely in favor of states' rights, was appointed to the Supreme Court. And Anthony Kennedy, less conservative, but certainly conservative and certainly in favor of of states' rights, was also appointed by Ronald Reagan. From this point forward, the court's rulings largely aligned with Reagan's views that states' rights and limited powers of government. In U.S. versus Lopez, that was a typo that I didn't catch. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the court held that Congress lacked the constitutional authority under the Commerce Clause to regulate guns within 1,000 feet of schools. Local gun control laws, even those involving schools, were a state, not federal matter. So Congress tried to pass a law that made it a crime to possess a gun within 1,000 feet of a school. They tried to use their Commerce Clause power, because guns are bought and sold, to regulate what seems like something that's not very related to commerce. And so the Supreme Court said that that they were overreaching, and that they didn't have that power under the Commerce Clause. And so for the first time in a long time, you see the Supreme Court pulling back on the broad authority that Congress had been granted since the New Deal era, to regulate using the Commerce Clause. In 2000, the court ruled that Congress exceeded its power again under the Commerce Clause, this time invalidating some provisions of the Violence Against Women's Act. Rulings under Chief Justice John Roberts, since Rehnquist retired, have been much more mixed. And so at this point, what you should do is go to Google Classroom and answer essential question number 18. What are the new trends of federalism?